May I welcome everybody here. Thank you for joining us on this extremely joyous occasion of celebrating His Holiness's 75th anniversary on his assumption of religious and temporal leadership in Tibet. It was exactly on this day in 1950 that His Holiness assumed the office of the religious and temporal leadership of Tibet. It's been 75 years, but of those 75 years spent in Tibet, and thereafter the remaining 66 have been spent in exile by him. Before I get on to the discussions, I'd just like to mention two little incidents that some of you may not be familiar with, which happened before he assumed this office and his childhood, which are very interesting, amusing anecdotes, which he refers to in his two autobiographies, Freedom in Exile and later the Voice for the Voiceless. The first was when he was identified or recognized as a Dalai Lama. He was 3 years old. His village was in the northeast of Tibet in Amdo province, and very soon word spread that he had been recognized as the Dalai Lama and that he would soon be moving to Lhasa for his training and upbringing as the Dalai Lama. But the local warlord, Chinese warlord, decided that he must demand a ransom. And then the ransom had to be paid to him. The Chinese government, of course, claims that they paid the ransom. I don't know the truth, but a ransom was paid before His Holiness and his family were brought to the Lhasa and where his upbringing took place. And then, as you all know, when he was still about 15 years old, there was the invasion in October 1950 by China. And there was a big debate as to how should the government continue. There was the regent, and people started demanding that the Dalai Lama should take over and be given the assumed office. But he was still 2 years short of the normal time that the young Dalai Lama would take over. But then people started demanding. There were people streeting on the streets asking for him to take over. So the seniors decided that they would consult the state oracles. So the state oracles were called, and they were dressed in their dresses, and they were supposed to dance. And then one of the oracles, in his dancing in a trance, came and placed the white scarf in His Holiness's lap and said, "The time has come." And that was how it was decided that he must take over. He took over. And then, of course, the rest is, I suppose, events that we all... One of the most important and unique contributions of the 14th Dalai Lama has been the promotion of constitutional democracy within the Tibetan community outside. This process he started very slowly, very gently, way back in the 1990s. And then, as you know, in the year 2011, he handed over all his temporal powers to the Central Tibetan Administration. And we have here with us the Sikyong, the president of this Central Tibetan Administration, with us, Mr. Penpat Sering. He's had a very long career in this field. In 1996, he was elected member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. He did 4 terms as in Parliament. He was also Speaker of the Parliament in exile. And then he became Sikyong in 2021. So over to you. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm sorry I was a little late because I was flying from Dharamsala. Normally we have several flights from Dharamsala, but today there were only 2, one in the morning and one late evening, and just managed to reach here on time. Of course, I missed Shiv Shankar Menanji's talk, which I would have learned a lot from. But I heard half of what Professor Chamasamdeng said and full of what Sri Raja Mohan said, because we grew up reading Raja Mohan's columns, learning about geopolitics and all that. So it's an honor to be on the same platform with Shiv Shankar Menanji, who was a very highly regarded diplomat, former National Security Advisor, former Secretary of Ministry of External Affairs, Ambassador, and also to be with Ambassador Dilip Sinhaji, who came out with his book, Great Game in Tibet.
Imperial Games.
Great Game in Imperial Tibet. So we have experts who have lived through history. Professor Chamba Samten is one of our senior most historians in the Tibetan exile community. So this morning we celebrated His Holiness' 75th anniversary of assuming the political and temporal leadership way back on November 17, 1950. And this takeover happened at a very, very critical time in Tibetan history, when China had just come up to the Tibetan border, Communist China having taken over parts of east and northeastern Tibet, came up to Chamdo and invaded Tibet from Chamdo on October 7th onwards, or 6th onwards. And just 1 month, 10 days after that, His Holiness was persuaded to take up on the responsibility, the spiritual and temporal responsibility. 6 months after that, of course, His Holiness had to come to Yatung or Chomo on the Indian border in case His Holiness had to seek asylum because of China's invasion on the border. And 6 months after that, we were forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement, which talks about, of course, quite a lot of autonomy for Tibet. If you go through the 17-point agreement, it allows for the institution of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama to continue, which says a lot. If China, what China says, that their narrative of history, Tibetan history, that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, then there is no reason for China to offer autonomy for Tibetans also. So I heard part of what Professor Chamba Samten said, and I don't want to repeat all those things, but to put the facts right, we have accepted history of more than 3,200 years of Tibet. And starting from the first king, Nyati Tsembo, that is 217 BC, up to the 7th and 9th king of Tibet, from between 7th to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. Tibet even went up to China and dethroned the Tang dynasty. They went up to present-day Uzbekistan. So that used to be the extent of Tibetan empire. And then we derived this, as Professor Chamba Samten said, we derived this Tibetan script from the Gupta Devanagari script. The Tibetan Buddhism came from India, the Nalanda tradition. So culturally, we are much more closer to India than any other country, including China. And then 400 years of disintegration. I was saying, during those periods, our lamas went to India to study Buddhism, and they came back. Many translators, famous translators, starting from Marpa Lozawa, they came back to Tibet and again brought vibrancy to Buddhism inside Tibet. Even at the end of the 400 years of disintegration, this is not something that is not much talked about. Even Bhaktiar Khilji sent 10,000 army into Tibet from Southeast India, into Tibet, and only 100 returned back. So that shows for the resilience of the Tibetan people at the border, even at the end of the 400 years of disintegration. And then we, of course, developed relations with the Mongols, and our relations with the Mongols went from 13th century to 18th century. We had more to do with the Mongols than with the Chinese. So when the Mongols invaded China, we already developed our relations with the Mongols, and it became the Yuan dynasty in China, whereas Mongols were there even before the Yuan and after the Yuan. So our relations with Mongols goes back many, many centuries. And then Mongols were overthrown by the Mings, from the 1368 to 1644, for almost 300 years, but we had hardly any relations with the Ming Chinese. Even historians talk about the Ming Empire of those days, but Tibet was never part of Ming Chinese. And Professor Chamba Samten also talked about the 5th Dalai Lama, his assumption of power in 1642, 2 years before the Qing overthrew the Mings in 1644. if you do comparative studies of histories, you will find that Tibetan history has preceded the Qing dynasty. And Qing became powerful between 1735 to 1795 for almost 60 years. Then they also went through what China today calls as 100 years of humiliation, starting from Opium War, and the colonization of China by Western powers. So when China themselves could not control their own population, how can they control the isolationist Tibetans? And then Professor talked about the Shefu Convention, the 85, 90, 93 conventions, then coming up to the 1904 invasion of Tibet by British India. He also mentioned the purposes of why it happened. I don't want to go into all those details, but here you have the Ambassador Dalip Sinha, who had wrote a whole book on the imperial game in China, or in those days, establishing influences of territories of influence. It was supposed to have ended by 1906, and then we were the one to sign the 1914 Shimla Agreement, which defines the McMahon Line today, whether we accept it or not. Tibet signed it as an independent state. So then again, beginning of last century also, we had invasion from British in central Tibet. We had the warlord Ma Bufang from northeastern Tibet, then Tao Fang from the Qing dynasty coming into Kham. So we were attacked from all sides at the beginning of the new millennium, last millennium. But then Raja Mohanji also mentioned about the 13th Dalai Lama and his reiteration of Tibetan independence. But sometimes it's construed more like Tibet became independent only after the reiteration of Declaration of Independence by the 13th Dalai Lama. It's not so. Tibet has always been independent. It has never been directly ruled by any governments, including China. So the taking over of the assumption of political and temporal leadership of Tibet by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on November 17, 1950, when Tibet was an independent state. Because according to international law, they say Tibet became part of China after we were forced to sign the 17-point, as the so-called 17-point agreement. So I would highly recommend you to read several books, of course, written by Ambassador Dalip Sinha, then former Secretary Nirupama Rao, Fractured Himalayas. Then I would also highly recommend you read this Tibet Brief 2020. In the Indian version is Tibet Explained, written by Michael van Praag and his partner Meek Bolthius. They looked at Tibetan history from the traditional definition of sovereignty in the region, and also post-modern nation state definition of the state, looks at international law and then proves that Tibet has never been considered part of China through international law. And then I would also recommend another book by a Professor Lo Han Shang, who's based in Las Vegas. He was Chinese, and when he used to go to school, they used to be taught that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Then when he was in his universities in the 60s, then he learned that the Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, is asking every other government to say that Tibet is part of PRC. So as a Chinese, it struck him as to why the Chinese government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of China if Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. So he started studying, he downloaded all the imperial Chinese historical records of the Yuan from 1271 to 1368, to Ming from 1368 to 1644, and Qings from 1644 to 1911. And he proves that imperial China, if you can consider the Yuans, who are Mongols, and the Manchus, the Qings, as Chinese, then imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. So that history proves, and it's a Chinese professor who's writing, it's not a Tibetan professor. So despite the historical fact of Tibet being an independent state, we don't have a Hanuman like the Indians have to lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere else, wherever we want. So whenever we get to go back to Tibet, we have to live in harmony with Chinese. We lived with Chinese for centuries. Maybe they were not able to climb up the mountains, we were not able to go down the mountains, but we were neighbors. just like with Nepal or Bhutan or India, different status those days, but we have to, in future also, we have to live in peace with each other. Therefore, His Holiness suggested, came out with the middle way policy. So when His Holiness says middle, then there are ends to it. So one end is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, and the other end is the present condition of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. So His Holiness is asking for a middle way. So as Sikyong now leading the Tibetan people on political front, we are of course very, very committed to finding a negotiated, mutually beneficial, non-violent solution that could be lasting. Because if you look at all the conflicts around the world, you don't know whether you're resolving one problem or you're creating more problems for future. So His Holiness always appreciated the collective benefit or oneness of humanity, broader humanity, and all that. Since His Holiness appreciates the concept of European Union, because of which His Holiness says that if not for the concept of European Union, Europeans will still be killing each other. So if that can be applied to Europe, then why not Tibet with China as well? And our hope is that if such a solution can come peacefully, then it can bring more peace for the whole subcontinent, not just between China and Tibet, not just between China and India. There has to be broader stability and security issues that could be resolved through trust between the Tibetans and Chinese and Tibetans and the Indians as well. So we decided, we are committed to the middle way, but we decided to change our strategy a little bit by focusing on the ends. If the governments around the world don't recognize the ends, then there's no value for the middle way. Because if every country keeps saying that Tibet is part of the People's Republic of China, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? Because governments say that, oh, we appreciate negotiations between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the representative of the Chinese government, or the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama with the Chinese government. At the same time, in the same breath, you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC. Then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? So to gain leverage for the middle way, so that China comes and talk to us, we worked for 2 years with the U.S. government, with the U.S. Congress, to pass this resolution called the act called the Resolve Tibet Act, which talks about Tibet being an unresolved, yet to be resolved conflict, which talks about Tibetan people's right to self-determination, which is very much in line with the 1961 UN resolution on Tibet. And it also talks about countering China's false narrative on Tibetan history. That China's claims that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, His Holiness does not accept that, and the US government also does not accept China's false narrative, and they will work with like-minded countries to counter China's false narratives. And it also defines the territory of Tibet, because Tibetan people in all the 3 provinces are of one race. We follow the same religion. Politically, there may be ups and downs here and there, but the strength of religious leadership in all of Tibet extends far beyond the political the powers that the local chieftains had. So to understand, it's important to understand Tibet's history from a holistic point of view, not just linking it for the last few decades, because even India has been under subjugation for so long. Every country went through some or other form of colonization. And China's hegemonic ambitions were very, very clear. From the time communists came into power, they started attacking all the neighboring nationalities, as they call it. And today, China's policy is if there are no nationalities, then there will be no nationality issues. So which means, can you kill all the Tibetans to make sure that there are no Tibetan nationalities or the Uyghurs or the Mongolians in this southern side? You can't do that. So what they are doing now is to Sinicize everything in terms of language, which comes from India. Maybe my friend Professor Shamda Samden didn't talk about this. The language that came from India, Tibetan language, today is one among the 15 oldest languages in this world. And we transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali text into Tibet from 7th, 8th century to 13th century because before it almost vanished out of. And we are proud to be a repository of one part of ancient Indian knowledge, which His Holiness talks in the form of his fourth principle, commitment. So these, please. Yeah. So these facts, I think, need to be known. And when more governments accept the historical fact, we are not asking you to lie about Tibet. We are asking you, we are requesting you to accept the reality of the history of Tibet, just like UK changed the policy in 2008 during Cameron's time. Now we need to set the wrong right with the British government also. So you cannot distort history. History was what it was. Even in an individual's life, yesterday was history. In a nation's life also, yesterday was history. You cannot change history just on the whims and fancies of some politicians just because they get better business deals with China. I just want to close by saying, Raja Mohan pointed out about the challenges that we have. We do have a lot of challenges. His Holiness is 90. We just celebrated His Holiness' 90th birthday in July this year. And His Holiness is not going to be younger in the times to come. We know that for a fact. That's why His Holiness has been preparing us from 1960 onwards by introducing democracy and preparing the next generations of leadership, because of which even an ordinary person like me is in this position called Sikang today. And we have experienced, my predecessor served for 10 years, predecessor to that, Professor Samdang Rinpoche served as elected chief of the cabinet for 10 years. So we already have about 25, 26 years of governing ourselves with the guidance and leadership of His Holiness, but on our own as well, even when His Holiness will no longer be with us in future. So we are looking at different scenarios. We are looking at visibility of our relations with governments from other countries, try to institutionalize those relationships so that that can be maintained even when His Holiness is not with us in future. We are also looking at different scenarios, including status quo of the Chinese government. Look at some 7 different scenarios and look at what are the hopes and challenges for Tibetans. So we are looking at everything, every possible way that is at our disposal, because we always have a lot of problems with financial or human resources. Anjali is also here. So we had the U.S. foreign assistance cut, but we managed to get 50% of it, almost 50%. We are still working with the, I just came back from U.S. and Czech Republic after a month-long trip. We had some good meetings and hopefully things will shape out well. But we'll have to, despite the challenges of dispersing Tibetan community, we are trying to build back and bring some vibrancy into the compact communities, because of which we have been able to preserve our language, our culture, our religion in exile, what has been destroyed inside Tibet and China. So looking at His Holiness Reincarnation also, His Holiness has made it very clear that his lineage will continue, and the Dalai Lama, the contemporary trust of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama will continue, and that trust will be responsible for choosing the next Dalai Lama. China's position is 3. One is that they will look for His Holiness Reincarnation within China, and His Holiness' response is very simple: I will be born in a free world. And second, they say, oh, by tradition, Tibetans will have to use the golden urn. My response to this is the golden urn was supposed to have been introduced in 1793 after the first Gorkha War. It was that there were 8 Dalai Lamas before 1793. Does the Chinese government mean to say that the 8 Dalai Lamas before that were not Dalai Lamas? So, of course, they say, oh, His Holiness is using this as a political tool. Now, who's really using incarnation as a political tool? It's the Chinese government who is doing it, right? And government that does not believe in any religion now wants to be responsible for recognizing reincarnated lamas in the form of Order number 5, as we back in 2007. So His Holiness' response is, if the Chinese are really serious, they should learn Buddhism first, believe in the concept of life after death. And if the Chinese are really more serious about than that, then they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first, Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation second. Then even today, even Jiang Zemin is not with us. So His Holiness keeps saying, I'll live for another 2 decades and more. since this Tibetan New Year, His Holiness said, I'm going to live up to 130 years of age. So I tell that to the Chinese, this message is for you. You're waiting for this Dalai Lama to die. You're not concerned about the living 14, but you're more concerned about the yet to come 15, right? So if there are two Dalai Lamas in future, it'll be a lifelong headache. They won't be Xi Jinping to resolve that. So do you want a lifelong headache or not? So these are some of the things that we try to counter China with and reach out to the international community as much as we can, because as long as China does not respond positively to the pragmatic approach of His Holiness, we have two hands, His Holiness used to say. One goes to the Chinese side, one to the international side. If the Chinese responds to our proposals, then His Holiness will say bye-bye to the international community. So that's how we try to reach out. We have a lot of challenges, but we are not going to lose our hope. We'll keep fighting till the community, I see a lot of young Tibetans here, till we have the next generation of leadership to continue the cause. We will never give up. As His Holiness says, never give up.
All strength to you, sitting on this one. Thank you. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. Would you like to take over?
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of His Holiness Dalai Lama's 90th birthday organizing committee here in New Delhi, I would like to thank all the esteemed panelists here for sharing their expert perspectives on the enduring legacy of His Holiness Dalai Lama, as well as the larger issue of Tibet. I would now like to invite you all to join us for dinner and continue this conversation informally. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Yeah.